All right, everybody, here we are in pandemic mode, where we're going to start on chapter 14, the Civil War. So let's go over a couple things, how this is going to work while we're out, hopefully no longer than Thanksgiving break. But your packet for chapter 14 is going to be due on Monday or Tuesday, whenever you have class. I'll send an email that kind of details my expectations with that. Um, the packet's on Moodle. I also put the chapter 15 packet up there on Moodle for you to get as well. The due date for that will be sometime after break, uh, sometime during that first week after break. But we'll see how things work out if we're back in the building by then. We're going to have a short quiz, just like a 10 question type quiz on Monday over chapter 14 that I'm going to put on Moodle, and you'll do it on and during class on Moodle. Um, but that shouldn't take too long. So be ready for that as well on Monday or Tuesday, whenever it is that you have class that day. Okay. Uh, Chapter 14. So the Civil War. We're actually, believe it or not, we're going to cover the Civil War in just two videos. I'm going to send you the first one tonight. I would like for you to watch it in time for class tomorrow. I know that's asking a little bit more for first and second period Thursday, but there's no reason why you guys can't watch it for Friday's classes. And I'll make the second video early tomorrow, sometime tomorrow, and we'll have the link for that out to you tomorrow as well. Um, so look for an email from me, and as long as we're out, I'll be sending you video links and stuff for that. We'll see how things go. It might change a little bit. I cover some stuff in class time, but I also want to throw the videos out there so you can get that stuff. So anyway, so here we go, talking a little bit about the Civil War. So how did we get to this point? Okay, it's been a long time coming. You know, I said way back in like chapter 4 or chapter 5 rather, that it's really the Three-Fifths Compromise. And even if you go further back than that, you've got the differences between North and South that propel the country in these opposite directions. The North being one way, the South being the other. We've been talking about that again and again and again throughout the semester. Okay, so by the time we get to the 1800s, the division between North and South is growing clearer. Obviously, they double down on cotton with the invention of the cotton gin and other things, while the North becomes more industrial. It's a industrial versus an agrarian society. We'll talk about that a little bit here today. And then you get those compromises. Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, all these things propel us towards war, and the decisions made during the 1850s that we talked about in chapter 13 are all very partisan decisions, meaning, they either really positively affect one side or the other. There's not really any decisions made that are bipartisan in nature, that work for both the North and the South. But when you're dealing with such a divisive issue such as slavery, that's what you're going to get. All right, so let's take a look here at what are we looking at with the two sides of this war here. So there's advantages and disadvantages for both sides, starting with the North. Okay, the one big advantage in the war that the North has is really substantial economic resources. We know the population's greater. We know they've become more industrial. We know that they can transport things by train very easily. So the North has a lot of advantages over the South here. So that's one big one. Okay. Another big advantage that the North has is they really have strong political leadership, and not just Abraham Lincoln here. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is really, he has the right temperament, and he's the right person at this time. Arguably the worst time in our country's history. We're split apart into two opposing sides. But we have strong political leadership in a lot of areas here. One thing to understand, right? When the states secede, from the Union. When the Southern states secede from the Union, several members of Congress or the Senate actually stay with the North. They still represent their home state, but they stay as a member of the Senate or the Congress, even though the South has seceded. One example would be the future vice president of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson. He was a Tennessean, and of course Tennessee seceded from the Union, but Johnson stayed with the Union and represented Tennessee, even though Tennessee really wasn't part of the U.S. at the time. It's kind of a complicated thing, okay? In fact, let me explain this to you really quick. So the North, meaning the Union, never recognizes the secession of the Southern states. In other words, it says, these people have seceded, but everybody else that wants to stay on this side, even if you're from down there, you can still be part of the Union. But the governments of these Southern states vote and decide to leave, right? So imagine if Ohio wanted to secede and the Ohio House of Representatives and Senate decided to secede from the Union, and Ohio decides to do that, but our senators, U.S. senators, don't want to do that, Sherrod Brown and Rob Portman, so they stay in the Senate as part of the Union from Ohio, even though Ohio isn't part of the Union. I know that's kind of weird. But there's a lot of good politicians with strong leadership and good ideas that really make an advantage for the North during the Civil War. The South has advantages as well. Number one, the South has great military leadership. Most of the best generals in the United States at the time that the war started are Southerners. Some of the best generals in our country's history. You're talking about people like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, General Joseph Johnston, Joseph Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, several others, Jeb Stuart. There's a lot of great generals from the South that leave and join the South here, not because they believe in slavery necessarily, which is something we'll talk about later, but because their state left and they felt compelled to follow their state. That again goes to this idea of states' rights that has always been a big issue to the South. Remember the nullification, South Carolina is a southern state. They think the states created the government so they can somehow supersede it. All those same ideas that happened way back when are still present here. Another advantage in the South is there's a lot of support for the war in the South. The people in the South are behind it. They feel wronged by the North. They feel taken advantage of by Northern industry and Northern politicians and the overbearing population of the North that wants to try to impose its social ideologies on them. So support of the war is very strong in the South. And that was something that was absolutely necessary for this war to happen at all. If there's no support from the common people of the South, there's no way this war is going to happen. Another advantage to the South is the terrain. The majority of the fighting in the Civil War takes place in the South. Okay? I'm going to actually write something here that he's not going to be able to read. Oh my God. Whatever. That says fighting. I meant to say the fighting. Most of the fighting in this war takes place in the South. Why do I even bother to write stuff? I'll just make lines in random places. Right? So anyway, the terrain is a big advantage for the South here in the war because they know it well. They live here. They've been around for a long time. And most of the fighting, takes place down there. So that's a huge advantage. All right, let's talk about disadvantages a little bit. What are some of the disadvantages for the North? One, the same reason that the terrain is an advantage for the North, or for the South, is a disadvantage for the North. Most of the fighting takes place in the South. Not only is there a lack of familiarity to a certain degree with some of the terrain they're fighting on, but they also encounter hostility from Southern residents, common people in the South that hate the Yankees, hate the Northerners, because they're down there in what seems to be kind of a strange land to them, where where they're not welcome. So that's a disadvantage. Another problem the North really had was poor military leadership. Uh, until Ulysses S. Grant becomes the head general of the Union Army. And that doesn't officially happen until 1864. That's not a 9, that's a 4. 4. Until Ulysses S. Grant becomes the general overall in 1864, the North really has a lot of bad generals. The South had all the best ones, the North had all the worst ones. They were indecisive, they were unsure, they were in many ways intimidated by the military strategic and tactical talents that the Stonewall Jacksons and Robert E. Lees of the world had. They were at a big disadvantage here. So poor military leadership in the North is going to be a really big problem from the beginning of the war, so from about 1861 until Gettysburg in the middle of 1863. That's the turning point in the war. We, of course, will talk about that later, too. Another big disadvantage for the North was the fear of European intervention. The fear was that if Europe were to intervene in the war, they would intervene on the side of the South, because a weaker United States of America is good for Europe. So them being okay, European countries like Britain, Turkey actually was going to get involved, the Ottoman Empire at that time, and a couple other countries who want to see America weakened to better their opportunities for growth would have favored the South. And that was a big concern amongst many Northern politicians during the war, that if Europe intervenes on the side of the South, they're in big trouble. Let's talk about some of the Southern disadvantages as well. Okay. As strong as their military leadership was for the South, they had really bad political leadership. Jefferson Davis was not a good political leader. He was a good friend of Franklin Pierce, and we know how bad of a president Franklin Pierce was, so he must have learned a little something from him. And many of the other leaders were, quickly elected to take the seats that were vacated by Southern politicians that stayed with the Union. So you got a lot of inexperienced and vengeful, really, leaders who are driven more by disdain and hatred for the North than they are about really doing anything. So that's an issue. While the North has plenty of economic resources, we know the South doesn't. They don't have many railroads outside of cotton and some other things. They don't have a whole lot of crop-based provisions and things to provide. Financially, they don't have the ability to produce as much. They don't have the factory base to be able to make munitions and other things that soldiers need. So the South is at a huge disadvantage from an economic perspective as well. And then finally, as much as the strength as the terrain was early in the war, all the fighting taking place in the South in the end becomes a disadvantage, because the South gets absolutely demolished in this war. Cities are burned to the ground. Railroads, the few that are down there, are torn up and gotten rid of, cutting off Confederate supply lines. With all the fighting taking place out there, fields are filled with trenches and dead bodies and really other horrible things. So as much of an advantage as it was early in the war, by the end of the war, the terrain is really a disadvantage for the South. So, all right, so let's continue on. So this, by the way, is a mortar, that huge-looking cannon thing. So we're talking about some serious weapons here during the war. So let's talk a little bit about Northern economic mobilization. The North believes, of course, in something called economic nationalism. We can nationalize our economy quickly, turning factories into production houses for weapons and munitions and uniforms and food supplies and things for soldiers. We undergo this extensive economic nationalism in the North, commandeering railroad lines to send troops to different places and send munitions and all the stuff that they would need. Economic nationalism is a big key here for the North. And it gives us a huge advantage over the South. We're able to take, in other words, what I mean by this, we do the same thing in the world wars as well. We take the resources we have, meaning factories, meaning trains, and the railroads and all that stuff, and we turn it into something to be used for the war effort, right? That's what economic nationalism is. Because we have so many factories and a base for those things in the North, it's much easier for the North to do this than it is in the South, where obviously they have those difficulties. Another form of economic nationalism is quickly trying to expand the country. We do this through the form of two very important acts, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. Collectively, we'll call these actually super important AP point number 14. Dun, 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 dun. Ooh, that was bad. So super important AP point number 14, the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. So the Homestead Act was passed by Congress in 1862 that agreed to give 160 acres of land to anybody who would go settle in Western territories and live there up to 5 years. So you can get 160 acres for nothing. You could start your farm and start to build the life that you dreamed about when you left Europe. This was a real incentive for immigrants and poorer, or more, well, not poorer as much, but kind of more working class or more common man type people who want a life of a yeoman farmer and take advantage of that opportunity. So Homestead Act gives 160 acres of land to anybody who's willing to go west and settle and live there up to 5 years. Beyond the 5 years, they can move, but you figure in 5 years with 160 acres, you've built a good farm and you've developed something for yourself. The Morrill Act in 1864, I think. The Morrill Act is an act by Congress that had federal government land that could be sold, and the proceeds from the sale would be used to build colleges. Okay, so they would take this money, the states would take this money from the proceeds of a land sale and would turn it around and start building colleges, particularly colleges that taught things like agriculture, mining, and stuff like that. These are what we sometimes call land grant colleges. And examples would be the University of Iowa as a land grant college, Iowa State, Nebraska, most of the schools out there. Texas A&M, the A&M in Texas A&M when it was opened in the 1800s stands for agriculture and mining. So we're building up colleges and building up a college base around the country. And most importantly, the North is figuring we're getting people to move further and further out west, populating those regions with Northerners, and over time adding more states is an objective there. So, all right. What about other people and how they deal with the war, right? So, for women, it's very interesting. And there's a big cause and effect factor here, okay? Because you know I love that cause and effect, Ashley. So, anyway, so women during the war, like we see in every war, like we see in the world wars, like we saw in the American Revolution, we see women step up and take over the roles that men had previously had, whether it's running a family business, whether it's taking care of the home, whether it's working in retail type businesses. We see women really step up. But most notably, women step up in the field of nursing. Before the Civil War, nursing was almost entirely a male-dominated field. It is the war here where we see a lot of women step up as field nurses and help wounded soldiers. This is where we see kind of the transformation of the profession of nursing become more of a profession driven by women, okay, driven by females. So women really step up in this area. In fact, by the turn of the century, nursing positions are predominantly held by women. So, you know, that's a significant change. And you're seeing a career path being kind of ironed out and created that women can take rather than, you know, the previous, you know, again, it's a breakaway a little bit from the cult of domesticity, right? So That's a big deal for women. Stepping into nursing, looking for opportunities to better themselves. Education is another one where we see women take kind of more jobs. So we're starting to see, just a little bit more of a crack in that code of domesticity as women are finding careers that they can do and they can stay in. It gives them an opportunity to break away just a little bit more, and we have the Civil War to thank for that. So what about African Americans? Okay, African Americans, of course, are also involved. African Americans are also involved in the war, and we do see during the war a good deal of African American enlistments. They saw very limited action in the war and the fighting because even in the North, there was a little bit of a distrust about what might happen if we arm African Americans and former slaves. But we do see enlistments for blacks and them taking advantage of this opportunity to serve their country. They usually get the worst jobs, oftentimes not fighting, oftentimes doing like the dirty work, like digging trenches and labor type tasks. But the fact that we're allowing African Americans into the military to serve in this capacity, I guess it's a positive step, a step in the right direction, right? So you see that as well. Okay, so one other thing to talk about, and I'll get through this quick because I know this video has gone on a little longer than I anticipated. So let's talk a little bit about emancipation, the end of slavery, which is a really kind of tricky subject, right? Remember, as I told you last chapter, Abraham Lincoln never said, "I'm going to end slavery." He always promised to stop the further spread of slavery. Well, now that his election as president has caused the country to come apart, Lincoln's primary goal shifts away from the rhetoric about ending slavery and more about preserving the Union, getting the Union back together. So that's what Lincoln's all about for the majority of his presidency and during the war. He realizes that slavery is bad and that something has to happen about it. But Abraham Lincoln, as much as he is the hero of the man who ended slavery, I know President Trump said that other than him, only Abraham Lincoln has done more for black people. Right. Anyway, so Lincoln, his goal here becomes preserving the Union, more important than anything else. So that's Lincoln's primary goal as president during the war. We got to preserve the Union. We got to try to put this back together. And he's entirely focused on the war. Lincoln, as a Republican, is more moderate, a more moderate conservative. He realizes that he's not going to get the support that he needs if he becomes, too outlandish about it or too radical. And it's a term you're going to start hearing over the next couple chapters, radical Republicans. These are the Republicans that really, really pushed for and had to end slavery. Nothing less than the total emancipation of slavery. These are the William Lloyd Garrison types. And they had a significant voice in the Republican government during the war. So Lincoln does a very good job of balancing those two sides and slowly work towards the concept of emancipation, which ultimately comes through not through the Emancipation Proclamation, but through the 13th Amendment. All right, so the first half of the war does not go good for the United States. The Union. The first half of the war does not go good for the Union. The Union has very few victories of note from 1861 to 1863. The South wins virtually every significant battle. And in response to that, the Republican government of the North tries to find ways to help the war go better. One of these things is the Confiscation Act, which basically was a law that said that any slaves that were forced to work or forced to fight in the war or work for the South that were captured were immediately given their freedom. This, of course, does not sit well with the South, who really at this point, being the Confederate States of America, They don't feel like they have to obey these laws anyway. So as the war continues to go worse and worse, our government institutes the first military draft in our country's history. And it results in major riots in New York City, violence, death, and just basically nothing good. Okay, so that happens. So the war's going bad, and it's only going to get worse, right? So the war goes worse, the Emancipation Proclamation. So the book, interestingly, talks about the Battle of Antietam and calls it a Union victory. And I am going to call them out on that one. The Battle of Antietam, it really is not a Union victory. It's not a Confederate victory either, so I guess you could call it a tie. But it's one of these battles that is a technical victory for the Union because the South left first. But one thing you'll notice in the battles of the Civil War, especially the first half of the Civil War, throughout the whole war, the Union always has superior numbers in terms of numbers of soldiers. So the South, with their superior military talent, will go out and fight and really beat the crap out of the Union because we have bad generals. But then, because they've lost X number of soldiers, they decide they have to retreat and go on to somewhere else. So it's basically they come in, they beat the crap out of you, they leave, and then when you catch up with them again, they beat the crap out of you again, and so on and so forth, right? They wear you down, okay? So after the Battle of Antietam, which was September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day of the war, the bloodiest single day in American history, at least at that point, 23,100 people died at the Battle of Antietam. 23,100 casualties, about, give or take, which are more than the total number of casualties in the entire American Revolution. So to give you an idea how bad this war goes, and we'll talk about this more later, there you have it, right? So Lincoln, shortly after this, proclaims the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'm going to say something pretty controversial here also and say, which is really one of the most worthless pieces of legislation in our country's history. The Emancipation Proclamation frees all of the slaves, in theory, right? So this is the actual language of the Emancipation Proclamation. All slaves in these 11 slave states that left the Union. So, all those southern states, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. I think that's all. All the slaves there are given their freedom. But then it says the 4 slave states that stayed with the Union, which are Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, hard to think of Delaware as a slave state, hard to think of Delaware as a state, and Maryland. So Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, the slaves in those states are not given their freedom. Their freedom will be promised to them at the conclusion of the war. Okay? So at the end of the day, who is freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? Nobody, right? So a little bit strange. Right? Lincoln maybe feared that these other states may secede from the Union if their slaves were forced to be taken away. Who knows? But people often talk about the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation. But since the South considers itself its own country, they don't feel like they have to obey this rule. They don't have to feel like they have to obey this law. It would be like Canada making a law and expecting the United States to follow it. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So anyway, I've rambled on for a little bit too long here, so I'm going to stop there. Again, I expect this to be watched for class on tomorrow and Friday, and I'll send the other one, which I promise will be a little bit shorter. The other half of the notes on the Civil War I'll send you out tomorrow. All right? So that'll do it. See ya.